welcome to a special edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, June 16th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by a group of our local state representatives who are here to kind of bring us up to speed on what happened in the legislative session that ended a couple of weeks ago and going to be resuming again for a couple of days next week when the legislature virtually will reconvene to hold a veto override session of a couple of bills that Governor Phil Scott vetoed in the waning days of the legislative session. And we'll start off talking a little bit about that in a moment. But first, just wanted to say we're really pleased to have with us today Representative David Durfee, who represents Shasberry and part of Sunderland, Representative Seth Bongartz, who and Representative Kathleen James, who jointly represent the Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and the other part of Sunderland that Representative Durfee doesn't represent. So thank you all for making the time for this conversation today. Really appreciate it. Let's just dive right into it, I guess. The veto override session that you'll be remotely heading up to Montpelier for next week involves two bills that you passed, and then the governor came along and vetoed. That involved allowing non-U.S. citizens to vote in local elections in the towns of Winooski and Montpelier. I guess the governor thinks that rather than having individual towns setting individual rules, that there should be a statewide rule on that. But I wanted to hear what you all thought about the bills, what they purported to do, and the possibilities that they will in fact be overridden. So Representative Durfee, let me start with you, if I may. What do you think about those two bills, basically in general? Or did they make sense to allow non-U.S. citizens to vote in local elections, like for school boards or select boards or things like that? They wouldn't be able to vote in elections involving like U.S. senators or Congress or anything like that.
Right.
But, does that make sense? Does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah, I think it does. And let me just, before I get into an answer, say thank you for having us today. Yeah, there are actually three bills that were vetoed by the governor. So when we're back in session next week, we'll be looking at these two bills that you just mentioned, plus a third one that we can get to. These are two charter change bills, and it's fairly. We have several other charter change bills that came to us this year. Some went through, some haven't gone through yet. We'll probably take them up next year. But it's fairly routine for the legislature to approve the changes to charters that communities present to us. The law requires that the legislature does approve charter changes, so it gives us sort of the last say. But the individual communities have the option of presenting changes like this or not, as they wish. A little bit of the history, I think that at one point, and I would have to defer to others to come up with a date, but in the past, non-citizens, I understand, were allowed to vote in Vermont communities. So this is not setting a brand new precedent. And just to be clear, we're only talking about residents of these towns, Montpelier and Winooski, having the opportunity to vote. So it would be established residents who don't have citizenship for one reason or another, and it may be that they're in the process of applying. As we know, it can take a while to become a citizen if you're not one. So these two communities voted. They said among themselves that they wanted to have non-citizens have the right to vote. And the legislature passed them overwhelmingly. I think the votes were well over the 100 in one case and close to it in the other case, and without full participation that day. So I suspect that both of these have a strong chance of being overridden. I'll stop there and let the others jump in.
Okay, well, Seth, Kathleen, what are your feelings about the bill? Make sense or not?
the Brattleboro charter change, as I understand it, includes letting 16-year-olds vote. And so that was part of the floor debate, centered on that a little bit, and whether it's a good idea to let 16-year-olds vote. The evidence, I think, that was cited by the committee was that how crucial it is to establish voting habits early. And that once people, and the problem with 18 is that it's just at the point that they are off into the world, college or whatever, and you tend, then it's harder to get them into the habit of voting. So part of the rationale was that by letting 16-year-olds vote in these relatively low stakes local elections, you begin to get people at a young age into the habit of voting. And that's I think that makes total sense. Especially as we say it, as David mentioned, in the kind of, he didn't use the term, but low stakes local elections as opposed to the nationals. So there's that. And so I agree with David that in both of these cases, I think the likelihood is pretty strong that the legislature will override the veto. The third, Kathleen, do you want me to cede to you talking about the third one? Do you want me to, go ahead if you want to, or I'll do it.
Sure. Well, I think I just hopped on the website real quick just to confirm. I think the Brattleboro change which would have allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in local election did pass the House. I supported it. I'm not sure it made it through the Senate, and so I don't think that'll be part of our. I don't think that'll be part of our veto override session. But the Montpelier and Winooski bills, like Dave and like Seth, I strongly supported them. I think it's really important to remember some of the points that my colleagues have already pointed out. Plus, these are legal residents. These charter changes were overwhelmingly supported by local residents in Montpelier and Winooski. They want this. And I think that expanding the voting franchise to folks who, have chosen these communities as a place to live and work and raise their families and pay taxes and send their kids to school is only to the good. It promotes civic engagement, informed civic engagement, and it's a way to build community. And as Dave pointed out, there are many reasons that folks might not have U.S. citizenship yet. The most salient being that it's a long, hard path and takes many years often. So I think we have the support to override, and I hope that we do. The Vermont League of Cities and Towns strongly supports both of these bills, which is interesting. And according to their research, this is, and I hope this is accurate, but the Vermont League of Cities and Towns said that this is to their knowledge, the only charter change ever vetoed by a governor of Vermont. So I hope that we can override that and give the citizens of these two communities the expanded voting rights for their residents and neighbors that they're looking for.
Well, it's certainly an interesting question. I guess it gets down to a local control issue pretty quickly, which was pointed out by, I guess, a number of your colleagues back when the governor vetoed it in response to his suggestion that it should be a statewide standard or referendum or whatever. But a lot of interesting aspects to all of this. I'd love to discuss this further, but we have a lot of other things to talk about in our time today. So I guess we'll just leave it there for now and follow the action then next week when you make a decision on that. So I guess the main thing I wanted to hear from all of you were your reflections and your thoughts on the session that I guess more or less sort of adjourned there back in May. It was an unusual session, as was often commented on. You were working remotely. You were not able to be in the building with your colleagues and discuss bills face to face or over the water cooler or in the cafeteria or whatever, as I suppose is typical. And then of course we had the influx of federal dollars to come in that kind of definitely reshuffled the financial deck a little bit. And several really important issues, obviously recovery from the pandemic being probably first and foremost, but you had a chance to weigh in on things like climate action related bills, broadband, affordable housing, childcare. Those are just a couple that come quickly to mind. But let me stop there and give each one of you a chance to kind of just say what you think were the most important tasks that were accomplished. And I guess maybe I'll go back to Representative Durfee and hear from you first, and then we'll go around the table. I should also mention to everyone, we're hoping to have Representative Kelly Payala join us. She represents Stratton, Jamaica, Winhall, Londonderry, and Weston. I really ought to get in the habit of doing those by alphabetical order because it's hard to remember them all. But she's sent us a message before we got started that she was running a little bit late, and hopefully she'll be able to join us before the program ends. But so, Representative Durfee, your thoughts on the session?
Well, you mentioned the some of the key ones. We passed, looks like the House passed 100 bills this session, and that is not too far off what we would have done in the first year of a normal biennium. So I think we managed to get a lot done, even though we were not able to see one another in the halls and chat about things and discuss the legislation before us in the way we normally would. I think when we look back some years from now on this session at just the legislation that went through, certainly the broadband bill would be, I would expect, right up there, and setting the way for childcare in 171, H 171 as well. We've been talking about, I mean, we literally, I think, in conversations like this with you, Andrew, have been talking about broadband for several years, as long as I've been a legislator, and the conversation dates back before that. It was always a question of funding. We also needed to deal with the fact that it's a telecommunications matter, which is regulated at the federal level, but ultimately funding was the problem. And we now are in a position through the ARPA funds that you mentioned, and just the general will, I think, of the people to make something happen. So H360 is really a big leap forward. We won't see the results of that right away. It won't be the end of 2021. Well, the problem will be solved, but in a few years, we will look back and say, okay, H360 is what did it.
We'll go back to you, Representative Bongartz.
Clearly broadband, childcare that David mentioned. And the other thing, the other crisis that we have in this state is housing, be it technically affordable housing or the sort of buzzword, and where I think we all probably think the real issue is right now is workforce housing or middle class housing, where it's just out of reach for so many people. And we put on the order, it's a little hard to count because there were different buckets in different places, but a couple $100 million into affordable housing. VHCB has $120 million as a result of the session for housing. And one of the tricks is going to be over time to see how we can also leverage some of that, not just for technically affordable housing, but also for that issue of workforce housing. But the fact, that Senator Sorokin over the last several years had been trying to put together a pot of $50 million for housing, wasn't able to do it because there's all kinds of demands for those resources. But here we are this year because of a combination of a state surplus, the budget surplus, and the ARPA funds, able to put a lot of money into housing in a way that's really going to make a difference. And before we leave, there's also $120 million for clean water, which is going to be mostly for sewer and water infrastructure. And that's huge. That's a prerequisite for affordable housing. Those two are linked. So in some ways there's even more than that. And one thing, I don't want to take up all the bandwidth here, but and leave nothing for Kathleen to talk about, but we laid the groundwork also, and I think it's really important, the work that was done on the pension issue, and Representative Durfee was involved in this. Well, we all were indirectly, but he was especially. And so, actually, so was Kathleen. So also, but we really laid the groundwork in a way that I'm not sure people realize how important the work that got done this year was, because we're going to deal with this issue next year, because we must deal with the pension issue, and through a combination of some early money, but mostly setting up the commission, setting up the number one, the board, the oversight board better, and then number two, the work to the committees are going to do to pull the bill together and be ready for this year. We really did the groundwork for true pension reform and dealing with that crisis. So I'll stop. There's tons more, but I'll stop.
All right, we'll get to more of that, I'm sure, before we're finished. But Representative James, over to you. Your takeaways from the session.
Yeah, it was a couple of things. I mean, it was really a remarkably productive session considering the Zoom environment. We got such important work done. And one thing that was just a sort of a logistical note was the incredible level of access and public transparency that was provided to residents all over Vermont by the fact that every committee hearing and floor session was broadcast in real time, live streamed on YouTube, and is still archived there now. So, if anybody's looking for some summer TV watching, you can go back and watch any hearing that you want. And that was really, the State House doors are always open, and that's important. But, it's not everyone that can drive up to attend a committee hearing in the middle of a workday. And in fact, it's not many people who can. And but anybody can, or almost anybody can, hop onto YouTube and watch a hearing and watch us do our work. And so I think that level of access and transparency was really a game changer. And I hope that we're committed to finding a way to continuing that in the future. But this is, Dave and Seth have hit some of the big highlights. I had a little list here I want to make sure that we covered. And so we've talked about broadband and housing and childcare and the pension situation. I mean, in all, we pumped $600 million of ARPA money, about half of our ARPA funds out into the economy through basically through the budget and a few other bills. And so there's an incredible amount of stimulus money flowing. We expanded vote by mail, which is certainly something we could talk about later. I was excited about that bill. But in the Education Committee where I serve, we had an incredible session and worked very collaboratively with Senate Education, which is chaired by, Senator Campion from Bennington County. So that was nice. And together, the House and the Senate Education Committees, and then our full bodies, passed some really meaningful bills. We passed a literacy bill that's going to tap into more than $3 million across the state to help train teachers to better teach our students to read. We passed a school construction bill that will put into motion a statewide inventory and assessment to take a look at the aging state of many of our school buildings and update those facility standards. And this also includes a process for setting up some metrics or ranking systems. So once the inventory and assessment is done, we can figure out a way to prioritize the schools that might need help the most. We passed a community schools bill that I'm very excited about because I was the lead sponsor on that. And community schools, it's a particular approach or model toward public education that brings many, many wraparound services and support systems right into the building where families, and especially at-risk families, can better access them. It's really a bill aimed at breaking down barriers that so many of our students face to learning out of school. And then, almost $90 million in funding to get the Vermont State Colleges, back on track. So a lot of important work got done.
Andrew, we shouldn't just leave, we all say this, I think, but just to make sure we say it today, what really happened with this session, it's going to continue the next session, is really laying the groundwork for the next I don't know how you quantify the years, but 25 to 50 years of Vermont being successful. And these are the we've talked about between the three of us, the really key needs in Vermont: housing, childcare, broadband, a few other things, but take those three and really made significant game-changing investments in all. Well, the childcare will come next year, but the childcare is coming. But made significant investments that are going to really deal with those three almost crisis issues, if you will, in a really substantial way. Sorry to interrupt, but just want to make sure that got all tied together.
That's fine. Interrupt me anytime you want.
Yeah, okay.
So Representative James, the thought of binge watching the legislature on YouTube over the summer is one that's made my heart skip a beat here.
Probably not in a good way, maybe, or
it appeals to the nerd end of the spectrum where I tend to hang out every now and then. But anyway, I just wanted I wanted to talk also about some of the things that got held up or you'll be tackling next year, the pension issue obviously being one. But before we move on to that, I just wanted to ask you, what is the story with this, I don't know if glitch is the right word, with the ARPA funds that were supposed to go to towns that, and also to counties, but here in Vermont, of course, we don't really have county government in the sense that, let's say they have in New York. And I understand that there's some question as to whether or not that money will indeed pass through the county governments and back to individual towns. I know this is something that's just come up in the last couple of days, but I just wondered if any of you had any insights into that, or whether this is just sort of a bureaucratic hang-up that will be easily fixed, or is this going to be a thing where county governments will suddenly be awash in money they won't know how to spend, and towns that could potentially spend the money on sewer projects, let's say, or something else, will be kind of waiting longer than they had planned.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with let's hope it's a bureaucratic glitch that our congressional delegation in DC can fix. I actually hadn't heard about this stumbling block until I read about it this morning. But it sounds like Senators Leahy and Sanders and Peter Welch are all over it, and some other states that had this problem did receive waivers. So I would hope there's a precedent set already for similar states that don't have robust county government, being able to flow the money directly to the municipalities as we had been planning and expecting to do. So I'm going to put my money on our senators and Congressman Welch, that they're going to be able to fix this for us.
All right. Well, let us hope so. Anyway, on then to what didn't get passed. And Representative Bongartz, you mentioned the pensions bill. Obviously, that's a major problem. There was a lot of attention paid to it this past session. Where does that stand? I mean, it sounds like it's an awful lot of money and a problem that's, I guess it's like sort of someone who spends too much on a credit card and then the interest payments keep piling up more and more. Do you think there's a solution on the horizon come next year that will be ready for you and your colleagues to tackle and maybe come up with a plan? Or is this one of these really complicated, thorny problems that's going to defy a solution like it seems to have defied for the past, 15 or 20 years? And Seth, since you brought the subject up, I'll go to you and hear what you have to say on that.
You have to be careful making predictions about this, so I'll be careful about making predictions. But I think there's a real will to deal with it. I think the need is it's become so acute, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that I think from 2007, I think, through this year, we have actually put in the legislature has actually put in the required money on a year-to-year basis. It's just that because of the shortfall in funding, especially in the 90s, and overly robust projections by the board, by the oversight board for what the returns on investment were going to be, and the third factor being the recession, those three things together conspired to set us behind. And you make the point, Andrew, that once you're behind, it's really hard to catch up. It's just like saving for retirement. If you got to start doing it in your 20s and 30s, and if you don't, it's awfully hard to catch up because you've missed all that compounding. And so that's what happened here. And I think the legislature took it. It wasn't maybe seen as much as I think it should have been as a substantial step of restructuring the board this year, and got that done, because that's a piece of the puzzle, and it's not an insignificant piece of the puzzle, and that's where a little bit of part of the issue came from. But in the end, as you're kind of suggesting, it's going to be tough decision making with all kinds of combinations of factors. But we have got to, and I think the committee will come to us with a recommendation. And I think the will, I believe the will is there to get it done. And it's going to require something of all of us, I think, before we get it solved.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, there is a committee or task force. I'm not sure what it is that was agreed to in legislation and with the interested parties that will be convening shortly, if they haven't already, to come up with a recommendation that they'll then present to us come January, ideally, in any case.
Just to put some perspective on this, this is what, a $7 billion problem? Is that the size of the shortfall? Is that roughly what it is? I've heard all kinds of different numbers, so I wanted to kind of get a clear sense.
That sounds a little bit high, but I haven't reviewed it in the past few days, Andrew, so I'm not sure if that number is accurate or not.
Yeah, I've heard anywhere from like 4 to roughly 7 or so. And this is for, just to be clear, state employees and teachers, primarily their retirement plans.
And sorry, Andrew, just to interrupt, since you invited interruptions, it is state employees and teachers. It's not municipal employees whose pension plan is in much better shape. And it's a different type of plan, which I think gives us perhaps a model to look at. It is a defined benefit plan. It's a pension, but it's operated a little bit differently, and is not in trouble the way that the other two are.
I'm sorry, Kathleen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to pitch in, I think the combined unfunded liability together between the two funds, state employees and teachers, is $5.6 billion. That's the number I have seen the most. But how it helps me to think about it, instead of thinking only of that total, is in terms of sort of future demand on the system. And so what that really translates to is that the state employee system has about 66% of the assets that it needs to meet its future obligations. So the benefits that are promised to be paid out to employees in the system, we only have 66% of the money we need to do that. And the teachers fund is in a worse shape. Unfortunately, we have 51% of the assets that we need to meet those future obligations. So I've always liked those numbers a little bit better than just that massive 5.6 number, because it helps me envision the ground that we have to make up in each fund in order to keep the promises that we've made to state employees and to our teachers. And the only thing I would add is that this is always going to be a painful conversation, and it was always going to be a painful conversation, but it was particularly wrenching to be having this crisis sort of come to a head right at a time when our teachers and our state employees and our troopers were helping our state and leading our state through a crisis, through a pandemic. I mean, we have, teachers teaching under incredibly difficult conditions. And, that is not the time that anybody wants to be saying, your retirement system is in worse trouble than we thought. And I think that I've had a number of people ask me, why do we have to talk about this now? It was a problem last year. It's going to be a problem next year, yes. But it's going to be a more and more severe problem the longer we wait. It's going to get harder to solve. And also, it's helpful for me to understand that when when Treasurer Pierce asked for a reassessment of those experience ratings, that just happened this past, I think, December or January is when those were released. And it turned out, as Seth mentioned, that we were using not far too optimistic, but too optimistic an expectation of returns on that fund. And once we basically downgraded from 7.5% expected returns to 7%, the gap got bigger. It was a math thing. So, it's a tough one. As Seth said, I think the solution is going to and should require all of us to pitch in.
And just one more word on that. We obviously would not be doing anybody a favor by not dealing with it. Just to state the obvious.
Sure.
If we don't deal with it, we are doing a disservice to everybody involved, from the teachers to the state employees to the taxpayers. So it must happen.
Because I'm assuming at some point there wouldn't be any money to pay for the retirement or pensions that the teachers and the other workers are anticipating and planning on. Boy, this is a great subject. We could probably spend the entire show talking about the ins and outs of this, but I'll just move on from there for a moment and just really quickly ask you: are there any other really burning issues that you think the legislature will need to tackle next year? I mean, next year is going to be an election year as well. It's a slightly different spin on things, but beyond the pension question, is there? I know we talked about a couple of other things like childcare and housing earlier. Is there something that really comes to mind that next year we really got to tackle X?
I've got one because it's how I'm going to be spending my summer. So, we passed a bill S13 that set up a summer task force that I'll be serving on to take a look at our education finance system, the way we fund our schools. And in particular, it's looking at one kind of critical element of that equation, and those are the weights. And folks who've been following this this year, because it was a bill that passed through my committee, House Education, and Dave's committee, House Ways and Means, and then obviously on the Senate side. But the weights are essentially a numerical calculation or equation built into our education funding process that accounts for the different costs of educating varying categories of students. So it basically acknowledges in a mathematical way that it costs more to educate a secondary student than it does to educate, say, a pre-K student, that it costs more to educate students who are English language learners, and in particular, that it costs more to educate students who are economically deprived or living in poverty. And so a study that was commissioned by the legislature and delivered to us just prior to the pandemic by a team of experts at UVM concluded that the weights we've been using are outdated and no longer accurate. They don't accurately reflect those costs. And they proposed a new system of weights. And we've got a task force set up this summer. And our intent is to deliver a written report and probably a bill, a piece of legislation to the legislature in January to revise those. And that'll be a hot topic because, anything to do with education finance impacts our schools and our school budgets and our kids and our property taxes. So that's one that I said will be taking up quite a bit of time for me this summer. And there are others that I can let Dave and Seth speak to.
Well, Representative Durfee, over to you, since on the Ways and Means Committee, I'm sure this will come before your committee there at some point. What's your sense of that? I mean, what I've heard about the weighting system, for lack of a better term, is that one of the issues is going to be that some towns will benefit and some towns won't. Some towns who currently, I think Winooski is one of them actually, to go back to them for a second, where, you know, their tax situation would improve because they have a high number of students that do have, you know, like English as a second
English language learners, right? They have some dozens of languages spoken as first languages among the students in their district, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I think you're right. Winooski is a community in Vermont that has historically been underweighted, and if you look around the state, there are towns that are underweighted and towns that have been overweighted, some more so and some less. In this corner of the state, I think that the communities have largely been underweighted for not so much for language learners, but for economic disadvantage, and possibly for rurality as well. So, yeah, this when you asked the question, this was the first thing in my head too, as far as what's critical for next year. The weighting study is now approaching 2 years old, so it's been sitting out there for a while. The legislature wasn't ready to jump in and implement the changes that it recommended, because partly because of the pandemic, I would say, but also just because it is going to have an impact on some communities that have benefited historically from being overweighted, that have benefited financially and had more taxing capacity to spend on their schools. And implementing the changes is going to mean that they will take a bit of a financial hit. And I think part of, I don't want to speak for the task force or for Representative James, but I think part of their charge will be coming up with a way to ease that transition financially. But I also think we shouldn't focus too much on those communities. Those communities have benefited, in some cases, tremendously over the years from these weights that we understand now have not been accurate. And perhaps the focus should be more on the communities that have been underweighted over the years, and making sure that we're not delaying too much longer in assisting them. I just wanted to briefly, or quickly anyway, transition to another topic, and we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it necessarily, but in terms of things that we didn't address this year, another that comes to mind for me is the Transportation Climate Initiative, and joining that regional consortium of states that are looking at addressing the transportation sector as the biggest contributor to carbon emissions. The 2 years ago, or I guess it was January 2020 when we convened, there was some hope that we would perhaps be able to address it in that session. We didn't. We were cut short in March, of course, last year, and then the decision was made at the governor's level not to jump in. So the legislature will have a chance next year to work with the governor, hopefully, but either way, to say we want Vermont to be part of this initiative. So there's a lot that can be said about that, but I just want to name that, put that out there as I think a key thing that we weren't able to get to, and hopefully will next year.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised the issue of TCI, Dave, because I think it's a really important initiative, and I hope we can find a way forward with that. And similarly, along a similar vein, the Vermont Climate Council that we established in the Global Warming Solutions Act has been meeting, and all of its subcommittees have been working very hard, and their draft plan, I believe, last I heard anyway, was scheduled to be released in October for public comment and feedback, and with the final draft due in December. And I would assume that a lot of work and legislation would flow from the conclusions of that really important report, the climate plan.
Glad you
And
brought
there's
that one up.
apportionment.
So one other, I don't know how much time we have left in here, but one issue we should at least have people have on their radar, because we all will, is reapportionment.
All right.
You know, this is the year after the census. And the board will make a recommendation. I think it's a little bit later. They got held up partially because of the pandemic, but I think the recommendation will be out in November or December, maybe right before the legislature starts. You know, I forget the number. I didn't think to look this up before we came on, but it's something like every legislator, if it worked out absolutely perfectly, would have something like 4,600 constituents. And it's really a challenge. I was actually in the legislature years ago for a reapportionment and saw what a challenge it is to actually get the districts right, because you actually try to avoid what happened with Sunderland the last time, of having a town divided. It's disconcerting for the people of the town, and because, well, it's a town. And so you try to put it together in a way that you don't have to do that, and you try to have as many one-seat districts actually as possible, but sometimes 2 seats is the only way you can fit the towns together. So I just put that out there. Every 10 years, the district lines, at least potentially, change, although there is one of the factors they look at is doing what they can to keep existing districts intact. Or at least, but it'll be interesting to see if what happens with Sunderland. I think we all love representing Sunderland. As David always says, we've got more land and he's got more people in the way that Sunderland is divided. But we'll see. We'll just have to see how that plays out. And it's always a serious challenge to get that map right and then get it through the legislature.
I mean, do you think there's any chance that some districts will be radically redrawn, or is it more like, I mean, I guess that reflects on the demographics of the state, right? And I mean, I suppose over the past 20 or 30 years, the trend has been more representatives up in Chittenden County and up that end of the state than down here, if that's going to be a reflection of population. But is there any sort of foreshadowing of how that may go, or is it just way too early to really tell?
It's probably way too early, although I don't have any sense, looking at the three of us, or Kelly, I don't have any sense that it will be radically different. But I think the key words are way too early.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll leave that one there, although that certainly will be an interesting subject. I wanted to just swing back quickly to the education beat, if you will, because the last time I think we had all three of you on here, we ended with giving Representative James about 30 seconds to talk about the state colleges. And I remember promising the next time we got together, we would have a little more time to talk about that. Well, Representative James, I guess I'll go back to you. Yeah, I know some of the ARPA funds have gone into helping the state colleges keep their doors open, at least for next year. But as we all know, sort of like the pension situation, long-term financial questions looming here. Is there a sense that one of the other projects the legislature will be tackling might be, what is the long-term picture for the state colleges, or is it just going to be the case that because you'll have fewer college students for actually a variety of reasons, actually, it's kind of an interesting question between the number of students that will be in the pool and who may go to a college. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about how maybe technical education needs to have its moment, and we need carpenters and electricians and plumbers desperately, and it wouldn't surprise me that many students that in the past might have gone to a 2 or 4 year college because that's kind of what they were expected to do, might be saying, hey, I can make way more money as an electrician almost immediately and not go into a lot of student debt. So the state colleges face a number of problems, it seems to me, but I guess Representative James, you studied this far more closely than I have. What's your sense of what happens after 2022?
Well, just to quickly say, I couldn't agree with you more actually about tech ed and the trades. And I think that that's a really important part of our workforce development future. And we are working on a little workforce development event that we're trying to host later this summer. And I want to get tech down here. I've been talking to them about that. But I guess setting that aside, I think we made significant transformational progress on the Vermont State Colleges this session. The select committee on the future of public higher ed in Vermont, I served on that, and we delivered our report to the legislature in early January. And it contained a number of sort of stair-stepping recommendations for how we can not just stabilize, but really, transform the VCSC and get it set off on a path to the future. And a lot of that work is well underway. This legislature did its part this year. Our job this session was to deliver money. And thanks to ARPA, we were able to do that. I mentioned earlier that the total package to the state colleges was almost $90 million. And it's broken up into different categories. It's about, I have it here, it's about $35 million for their regular annual base appropriation, and that's a $5 million increase. It's $20 million to support the transformation of the system over the next 4 years, and to another $21 million in kind of bridge funding so that they can start reducing their structural deficit over the next 4 years. And then $12 million in scholarships, free tuition program pilots, workforce development, and then another $10 million to VSAC and VCSC through another bill. So it was a tremendous infusion of funds into the system. And meanwhile, the Board of Trustees at the state college system has adopted a transformation plan and is getting started on that work. And to have all of this happen without, campus closures is just, it's an astonishing stroke of good fortune that federal stimulus funds are flowing into our state just at precisely this time. So stay tuned. Next session, I think Peter Fagan and Representative Fagan and I will be introducing a bill that will do a better and more clear job of establishing the state college sort of mission and responsibility to the legislature. And we're going to be introducing some language that was recommended in the report that many other states have, just basically saying, hey, in exchange for your annual appropriation, state college system, this is what we expect you to do in terms of workforce development, in terms of affordability, in terms of making sure that classes are available to everyone all over the state. So obviously that'll involve, some more flexible remote and online options, but, not at the expense of closing a campus. So, we've come a long way from where we were when Chancellor Spalding issued his white paper and people were protesting in the streets in Montpelier, the fear of campus closures. We've made a lot of progress. I feel very good about it and very optimistic.
All right. Well, just real quick before we have to run here, I wanted to ask you kind of to go back to something we were talking about a little bit at the beginning of our conversation, the whole legislating remotely. What was that like? I mean, I imagine there's like everything else. There's an upside and a downside. Obviously, not having to be able to talk to your colleagues face to face or hash things out in committee rooms. Clearly a downside, but as you said, you didn't have to drive to Montpelier all the time either, nor did your constituents to keep tabs on what was going on. So I was wondering, next year when you go back and theoretically, but that will be back to in person since we're now Vermont getting a lot of positive publicity about being the first state in the country to hit that 80% vaccination milestone. So presumably will be, I think we made the front page of the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and there was also an article in the New York Times. So everybody now knows what a cool place Vermont is to live. But I just was wondering if you thought there might be some sort of hybrid setup whereby, in addition to you folks being back in the State House building and legislating face to face, as it were, that there might be still some aspect of that might be retained. Is that part of the plan, or still a work in progress?
I think it's definitely an ongoing conversation that will continue throughout the summer and into the start of the session, as far as what elements of the of remote legislating to try and hang on to. It certainly, right, it would be hard to argue that we are going to no longer allow people to testify remotely over Zoom. We have, I don't want to say always, because obviously it hasn't been always, but before there was Zoom, before there was a pandemic, there was telephone, and we would have witnesses testify by phone when it wasn't convenient for them to, or when they chose not to come into the committee room in Montpelier. So I imagine that we'll now be seeing people's faces rather than just their voices when they can't make it. I mean, you other folks have other thoughts on this too. I'll just say, in terms of voting, I would be surprised if we decide that we're going to retain electronic voting, just because doing so, I think, would require a broader consensus than I suspect we now have. I personally would say that I would like to see voting go back to the way it has been, where we need to be in the chamber to cast a vote.
If we're going the usual order here, I agree. And you asked about what it was like. I think one way that I've thought about it is that I think the committee meetings this year worked really well. I think it was pretty easy with Zoom to sort of follow. We had witnesses in. It worked well. You're always a little bit more hesitant to ask a question because you're on television and there's all this, and so it's not quite the banter that you have when you're in a committee room. But it worked, and we got a lot done. The real, and David alluded to this early on, the part that you really miss is just the ability to, like, look at the three of us. We know each other. We would be talking to each other in the halls in a way that we don't quite get to do with all kinds of other people, and that's where a lot gets done. That's where you can really keep track of what's going on in other committees. And I think that's the hardest part, is really having a sense of what was going on in other committees. And that'll be one of the reasons it's good to be back in the State House. I also wonder, I don't know the answer to this. I know that there's a lot of task forces, and the Speaker and the Pro Tem have a lot of people doing a lot of work trying to figure out how it's going to work next year. Because I think there's a sort of a heightened awareness and a heightened awareness of those little tiny committee rooms with poor ventilation. And even if we're not talking about COVID, they got issues. And I think it's not inconceivable, because I've heard this at least being discussed, that some of the committees will be meeting in adjacent buildings. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen, but the State House is really tiny, and those rooms are tiny, and it's my own view is it's not sustainable for too much longer. So
Representative James, about 60 seconds if you wanted to add any further thoughts.
Just if there's some way we can retain the resource of YouTube, not just for the public, but for legislators. I know a lot of us spent a decent amount of time watching committee hearings at night. It makes it very easy to follow bills, and easy to dip into Ways and Means and see what they're talking about in the, with taxes and stuff. And and you can also watch those YouTube videos to see committee hearings at like 1.5 speed. And so you can get a lot of work done very quickly and still retain comprehension. So I thought that was a great resource, and I hope we can keep that.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there for now. But again, I wanted to thank all three of you for making the time for this conversation today. Representatives David Durfee, Seth Bongartz, and Kathleen James. here with us to bring us up to speed on what happened in the legislature and also what we have to look forward to next week. I guess I'll bid you all farewell for the summer pretty much, but we'll definitely have to get back together again at some point towards the end of this year and do a little preview of what to expect when we have a clearer sense of how some of these study committees have shaken out and what you may have come up with. But anyway, in the meanwhile, thank you all very much for your time, and well, we'll see you again real soon. Meanwhile, have a great summer.